Okay, as I said before the break, the First World War had an impact on the ideas regarding the importance of bringing Europeans together in one way or another in creating some kind of more integrated Europe. And what we see is that from the 1920s onwards, from time to time, new initiatives were launched. Initiatives by intellectuals, by people from the elite, from time to time even politicians and governments that wanted to bring together much more countries, nation states, people on European continent. And what I just want to do in this part of the course is to refer to some of these initiatives. And I think the two first ones are the most important ones. And you can read a lot about them in literature about the history of European integration. And when we will visit the House of European History within a few weeks, I still have to organize a date with the guides from the museum, or at least I did not receive their answer. But what you will see there in the exhibition is that also that Pan-Europa movement is presented to the visitors, and the importance of this. It was not the first idea, but let's say after the First World War, the most important idea and the earliest. And Pan-Europa, in fact, refers to a book, to ideas of Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, which was a member of the traditional conservative aristocracy, European aristocracy, and he published a book in 1923, and that book created a lot of enthusiasm, resulted in the organization, the foundation, you could say, of the Pan-Europa movement. Did it have a lot of real impact? And we will see on the next slides the answer. Not really. But to a certain extent, it changed the minds of some intellectuals, some politicians who tried, starting from that idea, to change something in practice. But what was the book about? Maybe that's the most important question we have to answer in the beginning. In fact, in that book, Coudenhove-Kalergi presented his ideas about why and how Europe can be more united, how a much deeper collaboration can be organized between different nation states, why it was so important to do that. You can read the book, but it's not compulsory, of course. But I wrote one of the paragraphs on the slide just to stress, in fact, and to show to you at least what his ideas were. And I think it's very interesting to analyze a bit this quote. And what Coudenhove-Kalergi in 1923, so a bit more than 100 years ago, wrote in his book, and I quote, "Europe as a political concept does not exist. This part of the world includes nations and states installed in the chaos, in a barrel of gunpowder, of international conflicts, in a field of future conflicts. This is the European question. The mutual hate of the Europeans that poisons the atmosphere." It's not a really nice description of what was Europe at that time. And he refers to that European question. European question will only be solved by means of the union of Europe's nations. Okay? The biggest obstacle to the accomplishment of the United States of Europe, he refers to that. He sees a bit the United States of America as an example, as the 1,000 years old rivalry between the two most populated nations of Pan-Europa, Germany and France. So what is his analysis, do you think, in a nutshell? What do you think he advises to people in Europe? I think it's rather clear. Yeah, and we must stop that old rivalry, and then specifically between two countries, the two most populated countries, the two most, at that time, powerful countries on the European continent. He does not talk about Great Britain. He does not talk about Russia. He says we must collaborate more, we must unite Europe, stop with that old rivalry, bring together France and Germany. He does not really say how to do it. Yeah.
He doesn't mention the UK and Russia, but does he mention it anywhere else in the book?
Yeah, he refers to that. He refers to that. And that brings us to the next slide. What he puts forward is the organization of a federal union of European states, with France and Germany as the key actors or key players of that federal union of European states, which makes sense, I think, from the current, from the perspective of that time, because of the First World War, because of the 1870 war between both countries. What he also explicitly mentions is to leave out Russia and Great Britain. And why do you think? Why, in his opinion, it was not necessary to involve Russia in this initiative and Great Britain? Because he thought if we invite Russia and Great Britain to this initiative, this will cause problems. This will cause tensions. We do not want that. Why do you think?
I think because Russia is a huge country, God's imbalance. If you have France and Germany, Russia would still outplay them. And for UK, I think they have their Commonwealth, so they wouldn't really be interested in taking part in this initiative.
Yeah, I think the British explanation is correct. Britain was focused on its own colonial empire, the Commonwealth, and for Britain, the continent was not that important. Maybe Britain was too powerful. Yeah.
He was scared of the communist ideas bringing Russia.
Yeah. Coudenhove-Kalergi, for him, this had to be a democratic initiative. He was a member of the conservative aristocracy, very religious. And so that communist ideology that was in his mind not European, was impossible to combine with what he called the European values and traditions. And so Russia was not invited. In the beginning, he sought the support of Mussolini. And that's also very interesting to have a better idea of the background of Coudenhove-Kalergi, the network he was involved in. And at the same time, it also said something about how Mussolini in the beginning of the 1920s or later in the 1920s was perceived by Europeans. Why do you think he sought the support of Mussolini. Don't forget, Cardinal Kalergi, he was not a politician. He was an intellectual with a network, member of the European aristocracy. So he knew a lot of people all over the European continent. But he was not a real politician. But why do you think he sought the support of Mussolini? I think here we must refer to that conservative ideology of Cardinal Kalergi. Mussolini was a conservative. You could say he was much more than a conservative. He was also a fascist. But in the beginning of the career, political career of Mussolini, he received a lot of support from conservative intellectuals, from conservative politicians in Europe. And from our current perspective, we have a clear idea of Mussolini as a fascist who destabilized Italy, who created a lot of problems, who was an ally with Nazi Germany, a friend of Adolf Hitler. But in the beginning of the 1920s, a lot of people with a Christian democratic background, conservatives, they had a lot of respect for Mussolini and the way he, in the 1920s, stabilized Italy, brought political stability, even some way or another, economic prosperity in Italy. So I just refer here to that support of Mussolini to, in fact, to position Cardinal Kalergi and also the ideas of Cardinal Kalergi with the Pan-Europa movement. It was a traditional, conservative, Christian democratic movement in the beginning, who in fact supported law and order as a dam to a certain extent, also for communist ideologies. But at the same time, democracy was also important. And that's also why, after a while, the politicians involved in the Pan-Europa movement did not anymore wanted that support for Mussolini, because at a certain moment, it became more and more clear that Mussolini and his Italy developed towards an authoritarian regime and not a democratic regime as Democrats wanted in Europe. So you could say that this was an important movement in the beginning, who brought that idea of a united Europe to the public, and definitely to some politicians. And after a while, even as some politicians supported the ideas of Cardinal Kalergi, and this resulted in that so-called Pan-Europa movement. Also in France and in Germany, some individual politicians were interested in the ideas of Cardinal Kalergi and wanted to join that Pan-Europa movement. And here we can refer to Edouard Herriot, Aristide Briand, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in France, who after a while looked for a closer relationship, you could even say some kind of friendship with Germany, who in the course of the 1920s became more and more convinced that it was necessary to have more normal relations, political, diplomatic relations with Germany, and that this was very important for the stability of the European continent, and especially between Aristide Briand and Gustav Stresemann, who were both ministers of foreign affairs, France and Germany. They also had a very good personal relationship, apparently. And this in the beginning of the 1920s resulted in a better friendship between France and Germany. And this was also influenced, also very important, I think, because of the more or less economic prosperous years in the beginning of the 1920s. You could say that in most European countries from 1921, 1922, the economy started to recover, that living standards increased, prosperity increased, and of course this influenced politicians to look for more normal relationships. And also this had an impact on that better political understanding between France and Germany. And I think one of the concrete results of that improved relationship was the signing of the Locarno Treaty, and named after the city of Locarno in 1925, which was in fact a result of new negotiations between France, Germany, and Great Britain. Also, Austen Chamberlain was very much involved in these talks. Important was, in fact, that with the Locarno Treaty, the borders of Western Europe were guaranteed, not of Eastern Europe, and that became much more complicated, but of Western Europe, the borders were guaranteed. In fact, in reality, this implied that Germany, the German government, said, we agree with the new borders drew after the Paris-Versailles Peace Treaty, and also, and this was some kind of counter deal, you could say, Germany could enter from that moment the League of Nations. Why is this important? Maybe not because the League of Nations was important, an important international institution in the 1920s, 1930s. We can discuss about that, about the impact of it and the way it was successful or not. But for Germany, for the German government, do not forget the young German Weimar government, democratic government. This was the first sign that Germany became again a friend of the international family. And this was a sign of diplomatic and political rehabilitation of Germany. After the war, Germany became isolated from international institutions, international organizations. 1925, maybe thanks to that Pan-Europa movement, thanks to that very good personal relationship between Briand and Stresemann, Germany gradually became more and more integrated. Also because in the minds of a lot of European politicians, it became more and more clear that political stability on the European continent very much depended on political stability and economic prosperity in Germany, and how to organize that. And this was a gradual, a slow development, you could say, and a bit stimulated by the positive economic situation of Europe and even the world. Of course, and you know that, I think, that would change from 1929 onwards with the stock market crisis in New York, high inflation, etc., etc., which Germany already witnessed also in the 1920s. But I will not go into detail about that. So what you see is that, in fact, from the middle of the 1920s, Germany and France started to talk again with each other, looking for solutions, looking for an outcome to improve mutual relations, and in fact, you could say to forget a bit that First World War. And that was not easy, of course, because France wanted reparations, France wanted money, from Germany to stimulate, to foster its own economic recovery. It needed money, France, and Germany had to pay. At the same time, Germany wanted to end the occupation of the Rhineland. For them, it was a blame, and that a part of your country is occupied or demilitarized. And yeah, it was difficult to find a solution. A lot of negotiations, not that important for us. I think at the moment, I think the conclusion was that a real democratic breakthrough, diplomatic breakthrough, became impossible, and that had a lot to do with with the death of Stresemann, the German minister, who really was an advocate of improving the relations with France as a way of obtaining rehabilitation for Germany. So that was the first reason why I think the diplomatic talks were unsuccessful. I think a second one was that at the end of the 1920s, the economic situation became worse and worse, and countries became much more focused on their own economic interests. And for France, and from that moment onwards, and the reparations were very important, and even much more than before the economic crisis. Some pictures. What can we say more? Yeah. The two reasons. Well, I think the first reason why a real diplomatic breakthrough was unrealistic. It was first of all because Stresemann died in 1929. And I think, as I said before, one of the reasons why the relationships between France and Germany improved in the course of the 1920s was also because of the personal friendship between Stresemann and first and foremost Aristide Briand. Just to underline that the personal relationship between politicians can have an important impact on history, in fact. If you can get along with someone, then you can maybe do more than with other people. I think maybe that's for you the same. Can I give an example from my own personal experience? When I'm collaborating with colleagues in a project, I think when you can have a very good collaboration with someone because you share the same ideas about not only your profession, but also about a worldview, this can have an impact on a positive impact on the outcome of a project, of a research project. And so if relationship is more than only professional, but also means friendship, I think also for politicians, it can play an enormous role in a good way or in a bad way. I'm not sure I'm making myself clear, but I really believe in this. Imagine that. Yeah, also today, I think I have the impression that maybe it's not true, but at least I have the impression that Netanyahu from Israel shares a lot of values with Trump, and that has an impact on the relationship between the United States and Israel, and how they look both at the Gaza situation. If they do not have that same personal connection, then maybe they would react and act in another way. So that's the point I want to make, and what you can also read in a lot of articles regarding the Pan-Europa movement, the Locarno Treaty, is that special relationship between Aristide Briand and Gustav Stresemann played an important role. You could say because they had some kind of personal friendship, they listen much more to each other. They better understand the reasoning of the other, and that can help to solve problems. So that was the first reason. And then the second one, the worsening of the economic situation at the end of the 1920s, which definitely became clear with at the crash of Wall Street, the stock exchange in 1929. And I think that's also, I will come back to that many more times the next weeks, is that also the economic situation in the world or on the European continent very often had an impact on political decisions. Sometimes a positive impact, sometimes a negative impact. Sometimes you will see that, or at least that I think that's an important part of European integration history, is that in moments of crisis, political crisis, military crisis, economic crisis, that crisis situation can give a boost to further integration. Because it's necessary. Member states are pushed to look for more integration, for more collaboration. Think about the current situation with the geostrategical developments, and the fact that we cannot count anymore as before on the American military support, which now you see that more and more politicians again start to think about how can we collaborate more intensively regarding the military component, regarding a common defense policy. That's because of that crisis situation. But an economic crisis situation can also have a negative impact on integration. Because when the economy is not doing well, then very often politicians decide to start with more protectionist economic measures, to only look or to only have an eye for their own economic interests. And that's what also happened in the 1920s. At the end of the 1920s, the economic situation in the world worsened, and that had to do with the situation of overproduction, and I can explain that also. But at the end of the 1920s, you see that economic situation became worse. Countries did not want anymore to collaborate also in an economic way. They wanted to protect their own companies, their own industries from foreign competition. And what happened in the 1920s? That's not on the slide, I know, but maybe to give some more context information. And what you see after the First World War is that the economy recovered, but there was a big technological jump after the First World War. Also thanks to the First World War. Warfare also can have a positive impact on technological development. It's also what you see nowadays with the war in Ukraine, etc. And that also happened during the First World War. New technological developments, also a further economic integration worldwide. I can give you an example. The Europeans were focused on warfare between 1914 and 1918, but other countries, other economies profited from the war on the European continent. And we can then refer definitely to two countries. Which countries in the world, from an economic point of view, profited a lot from the First World War? The US. And if you have a look at the world map, the US is over there. And which country is at the other side? Japan. While European countries were fighting against each other, European companies had problems with, doing what they have to do, produce and sell goods all over the world. Trade circuits were handicapped because of the warfare. Other countries profited, other economies profited from the First World War. And definitely United States, definitely Japan. And Japan made a huge economic jump and boost, especially in the sector of textiles, for instance, during the First World War. So what happened after the war? The world economy became more and more integrated, new technologies to produce, and after a while that resulted in overproduction. Overproduction in the agricultural sector, but also in the industrial sector. And to give you one example from that worldwide economic integration or market integration, before the First World War, you could not buy butter from New Zealand on the European continent, or maybe a few tons, maybe. After the First World War, from 1922 and 1923 onwards, there was a massive import of agricultural products like butter from New Zealand. And that had to do with the fact that merchant fleet increased a lot during and thanks to the First World War. Technology to preserve, to deep freeze perishable products became more better, also thanks to the war. So that had an impact on the economic situation. And governments had to cope with that market integration, with that growing world economic competition. And when that resulted in overproduction, that had an impact on prices, of course, which was good for consumers, but on the other hand, bad for producers, and could have an impact on employment. And that's a bit what happened in the course of the 1920s. I do not want to give you a course in economic history, but I just want to underline how the situation of the economy, not only today, but also in the past, was very important if you want to understand political developments. And that's what happened in the 1920s. In the beginning, the first half of that decade, economic prosperity. But then from 25, 26 onwards, in specific sectors, growing economic problems caused by overproduction, falling prices. And if prices for farmers diminish, then farmers start to complain, start to protest. And then the question is, how shall governments react? They can stimulate modernization, or they can move towards protectionism. But that's an ideological decision and choice, of course, but maybe protectionism is not always the right answer to economic problems. So that was happening in the 1920s, and that's also one of the reasons why that rapprochement between France and Germany ended late 1920s, that of Stresemann, but also that bad economic situation. Which does not mean that this was the end of the Pan-Europa movement, and not at all. Briand, for instance, that French politician, he really still believed, that the future of Europe was an improving relationship between European countries, and definitely also between France and Germany. And in, I think, beginning of 1930, he gave a speech to the League of Nations in which he again referred to the importance of a United Nations of Europe. And also, I think it's interesting not to read the entire speech, but some paragraphs of that speech. And I quote here, "I believe that a sort of federal bond should exist between the nations geographically gathered as European countries. These nations should at any moment have the possibility of establishing contact, of discussing their interests, of adopting common resolutions, of creating amongst themselves a bond of solidarity that allows them, on suitable occasions, to face up to serious circumstances in case they arise. Evidently, the association will take place mainly in the economic domain. This is the most pressing question. What do you think he wants to underline here?
Could the success of the United States like influence the fact that they wanted to have a federal bond?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. That was for some politicians, for some intellectuals, that was the example. The way how the United States was organized as a federal country, also linking this to the economic growth of the United States from the late 19th century onwards. And the fact that already in the 1920s, the United States was the most powerful country in the world. From a political perspective, from an economic, and definitely from an economic perspective. But from a political perspective, the strategy of the United States was a bit curious, maybe, because after the First World War, they opted for a policy of political isolation. And that meant that although Woodrow Wilson was a big advocate of a League of Nations and trying to solve world problems on an international, transnational level, after the defeat of Wilson during the elections after the First World War, the United States opted for a strategy of political isolation. They didn't want to interfere a lot on the international sphere. For instance, United States was not a member of the League of Nations, although their own president, Woodrow Wilson, in 1919, was the biggest advocate of that League of Nations. But the new Congress in the United States did not want to sign that treaty or did not want to become a member of the League of Nations. And so definitely that the United States of America example that played an important role. But what is also important in this paragraph?
Countries to work together if there's a problem. The focus is mainly on
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think very important here is that he refers to the economic domain. And why is that important? Why the economic domain?
Everybody wants the same thing. They all want the
Yeah. Yeah. I think the economy is important, and even today. With a good economic policy in mind, you can win the elections. I think it was Bill Clinton who said once, it's the economy, stupid. That is what people are busy with during the elections, not the big ideological ideals, but their wage, their money. So the economy was very important also because of the economic problems of that time. But why? There are also other reasons. Why the economic domain and why not the political domain?
So countries could keep their sovereignty.
Yeah. Maybe it was much more easy, although also very difficult, but much more easy to have a more deeper collaboration regarding the economy than looking for political integration, because that's much more complicated. What is the European today? The European Union today? Is it an economic project or is it a political project? We are now more or less 100 years later. What do you think? Is the European Union a political project or an economic project? Or maybe both, but maybe not in an equal way.
I'll make it. So every country has their own saying about their own policies, about
Mhm.
what's happening in their own territory.
Yeah,
The whole European scales, there's also a bit of political.
yeah. Who agrees with this and who disagrees?
However, I do want to remember that the European Union kind of started a lot on the economic ground as well.
Mhm.
Like you said, like the coal and steel union and everything, it's all very economic based because it's like a more acceptable way of telling people, okay, let's do something together, let's make the economy better together, and then kind of like move slowly but surely towards a more political point of view, but also integrating the economy.
Yeah. And of course, it's a bit a combination of both, because if you want to have more economic integration, that's also a political decision, of course. But it's well defined. It's one specific sector of society, of life. And it all started also in the 1950s with specific sectors of the economy. It started with coal and steel, and then a few years later with market integration. So it's not a coincidence that Briand refers to that economic domain. Was it new? To a certain extent, it was new because he wanted to organize it on a European level. But at the same time, if you have a look at the long-term economic history of the European continent or of European nation states, then it was also from the 17th, 18th century onwards, a story of more integration, more centralization of the nation state, and also the economic played an important role, meaning abolishing internal trade barriers, taxes, etc. And also from that perspective, looking for more national, internal collaboration between regions, between cities. And so it was not new. It was new from the perspective different countries bringing together, but also not on a supranational level. And that, I think, was innovative in the proposal of Jean Monnet with European coal and steel community and with the European economic community, and to integrate that supranational perspective. Okay, what can do we see other important issues in the quote? I think what he also refers to, and maybe that's strange for you, I'm not sure, but he also says that these nations should at any moment have the possibility of establishing contact, of discussing their interests, of adopting common resolutions. And the fact that he says that federal bond will bring us all together. In fact, you could say before the Second World War, countries had, most of the contacts countries had with each other were on a bilateral level, not on a multilateral level. So countries made agreements with each other, France with Germany, Belgium with France, but not very often in group, you could say. And that's, I think, he also wants to underline here. At any moment, we can come together within that federal organization to have discussions all together with everyone involved. Because very often in the 1920s and the 1930s, countries made economic agreements with each other, but did not say a lot about what was decided. There were a lot of hidden agreements between countries. And definitely in moments of economic recession, this could create other problems and mistrust and distrust between countries. So I also think this was an important aspect he wanted to underline and to introduce, in fact, in the ideas regarding European integration. He wrote all his ideas down in the so-called Briand Memorandum, and he presented that in May 1930. In a nutshell, He wanted to coordinate economic policies, promote political union, but a political union, a federal organization, not a supranational collaboration, but in an intergovernmental way. And that was very important, and no sharing of national sovereignty or autonomy. How was it received, the Briand Memorandum? Not that positive. And most of the important European politicians and governments have found it too radical. The time was not ready to organize this. And especially also, and I already referred to that, especially also because of the bad economic situation, definitely in 1930, and because a lot of countries struggled with rising unemployment, high inflation, overproduction, etc., etc. A lot of social protests, and countries, governments were pushed to organize and to start with more and more protectionist measures. Also countries in Eastern Europe, in Southern Europe, where after the First World War, new young democracies were installed, where all males could vote, even a single farmer, and that had a huge impact on political decision making. And this, for instance, resulted in a lot of protectionist measures. Also in the 1930s and the following decade, countries on the European continent could not manage to come up with a common answer to that big economic crisis the world was witnessing. And everyone started to protect its own economy and its own industry, its own agriculture. And in the end, that was not a solution. And that also explains why, after the Second World War, or I even must say already during the Second World War, from 1944 onwards, and the ideas became more prominent to organize the economy and the world on an international and transnational level, and to start with important international organizations like the League of Nations, or the United Nations, my apologies, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. And that's when, let's say, the Western world in 44, 45 started with, how I can say we as a Belgian, how we wanted to organize the world on an international level, bringing countries together, looking together for solutions, not in an individual way. And it's maybe also this political system that is under threat today. But that's maybe for one of the next weeks. So too radical, too late, as you can read on the slide, because of the economic depression and recession. Governments opted for protecting their own economy, not for looking together for solutions. And in fact, you could say that in the course of the 1930s, the popularity of that Pan-Europa movement diminished profoundly, although some people continued with the ideas and promoting the ideas. Henriot, for instance, that other French politician, he published in 1931 a book, The United Nations of Europe. But I think to conclude here, the impact of the Pan-Europa movement was very limited, only in intellectual circles, and the economic problems of the 1930s had an important impact. A last slide, and then we have another break. Maybe not that important in the context of this course, but to give you two other examples of initiatives, people who started to reflect how can we bring Europe together, secure peace, foster economic and material prosperity, living standards. 1931, in the middle of the economic crisis and recession, we see that some countries started to look for collaboration, but not big initiatives. And very often neighboring countries with a more similar economy, an economy that was already integrated to a certain extent, and they wanted to collaborate, unite, you could say. And I think an example was the Austro-German customs union, which was proposed in 1931. It was an initiative of course, the German government and the Austrian government. And they also invited other countries to join. But this was never successful, mainly because France protested against this idea, because they did not want more integration, deeper integration between Germany and Austria. In fact, in 1931, they already feared some kind of domination of Germany over Austria, so-called Anschluss. And they feared, in fact, the economic and political impact of this new customs union, because they did not forget, or they were not forgotten, the impact of the so-called Zollverein in the 19th century, and the impact that Zollverein had on the German economy of the 19th century. And what was that Zollverein? Zollverein, if you translate that in English, customs union, tax union, you could say. I said already before this morning, modern Germany was founded in 1870 with the unification of all the German Länder and city-states. But before that, in 1834, many of these Länders and city-states or region or Länders, that's a translation, a good translation, I think. In 1834, they decided to integrate their economy and their market. You could say that it wasn't like the European Economic Community did in 1957. What happened in 1834, under the guidance of one of the biggest Länders or regions, Prussia, a lot of Länder, city-states had decided to abolish taxes, trade taxes between them, and to integrate their markets, to stimulate trade and to stimulate economic modernization. Because what they witnessed was that also other European countries profited from a big market, which became more free, internal free. And so they decided 1834 to abolish all taxes, trade barriers between the regions, the Länder, and some city-states, and unify their economy. And in reality, that had a big positive impact on the economic growth of the participating regions, Länder, and city-states in 1834. Yeah, do you understand that? Maybe you do. Maybe it's a bit strange for you, but also, like in Germany, but also in Belgium, for instance. Belgium was a unified, centralized country from 1830 onwards. But in Belgium, till 1860, all the cities had their own economic policy and tax policy. So cities in Belgium, like in Germany, the Länder, they could decide in what way they taxed consumer products. And they could use that to protect their own industry. To give you one example, I hope I will make myself clear, I'm not sure. But in Belgium, for instance, the city of Brussels had the right to tax the import of beer. Beer that came from Leuven or other cities in Belgium. And why did they do that? To earn some money, to invest in whatever a city has to pay for. But that is not a liberal policy. And very often also the city government here in Brussels used that tax to protect the Brussels brewers. And brewers for Brussels very often were important politicians. And so what happened, in fact, city taxes were used as a protectionist measure, which meant that beer in Brussels was more expensive maybe than in Leuven. If Leuven brewers could produce beer at a lower cost, Brussels brewers would say, oh, let's try to prevent the import of Leuven beer to Brussels. We shall use the tax policies for doing this. In the 19th century, the liberal economic ideology prevailed. And liberal economists, they said it's much better for the economy, for economic development, that trade and the economy is organized in a free way. We do not need these protectionist measures because this is a handicap, a barrier towards improve innovation, technological innovation. So that is what happened in that period. Therefore, the Belgian state in 1860 decided to abolish these kind of taxes. And then the Belgian territory became, for the first time since long, an integrated economy, consumer area. And that's also what happened with the Zollverein in 1834. And that is what in 1931 the German and the Austrian government also were thinking of. Let's create a big economic zone. And this will be good for the economy, for trade, and maybe in the end, and also for consumers. And that is why France and also other European countries were not in favor of this development. And they thought that this would, make Germany, Austria much stronger from an economic and maybe in the end also economic or political perspective. That's why they blocked it. Okay, that was a long explanation, just to point at another initiative, not to unite all European countries, but just from an economic perspective. And also here, again, only the economic was used as a first step towards the integration of two countries. And then maybe a last example here, also in Britain, and maybe that can come as a surprise, but also in Britain in the 1930s, intellectuals were thinking of more collaboration between European countries, even in the context of a federal union. This did not have a real big political impact, not at all. But what is important, you could say, or what we can try not to forget, is that the ideas of these British intellectuals regarding a European federal union in the 1930s, that they influenced Altiero Spinelli, who wrote a very important, in the history of European integration, a very important text, the so-called Ventoteno Manifesto. He was a member of the non-communist resistance in Italy, and was imprisoned during the war, and he wrote that manifesto, that text, in fact, in which he calls for a free and a united Europe after the war. And this text was very inspirational for a lot of politicians who, in the late 1940s and in the 1950s, started with really thinking about European integration, and in that period, Spinelli even became an important figure in that European integration process. But I will talk about that, I think, one of the next weeks. Okay, so that's the end of this long introduction part. I propose to have another break, finally, you will say. And then within 10 minutes, we come back and then have the third and the last part of this morning session. I know it's long, it's a lot of information. I hope it's clear for you, a bit structured, but I know myself, and from time to time, I start with an explanation that is maybe not the core of the slide, but it's just to, or I hope that it can help you to better understand this part of the course. And if you have questions, do not hesitate. Just ask. It's important that everything is clear. Okay? Yeah, thank you.